I have memories of teaching with my back to a window, and all of a sudden a gun battle erupts on the street right behind me, and I watch my students drop to the floor and roll into the corner to hide from the bullets. And I'm thinking, no one ever taught me how to respond to this. Like, this was not part of my PhD training. Like, when they teach you how to become a university prof, they don't tell you what to do in case of gunfire.
Welcome everybody, this is Simon Guilbeault with Inspired. It's great to be back for another week, another fantastic guest. Basically, if you're new to Inspired, it's all about telling, well, stories of faith in the fire, of overcoming through difficult challenges, some of the sucker punches of life. And we are bombarded with so much bad news and depressing stuff. So this is fighting back against that, and it's obviously hitting the spot because so many of you are tuning in and passing on to mates, which I'm thrilled about because that's what we wanted. And this week I've got a very good buddy. He's been through a lot of stuff. We've shared some of the journey in Burundi, and I'm thrilled to have with us George Watts. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
Brilliant. And you're talking to me from Kenya right now. And we're going to get to a whole load of stuff. But why don't we start? What I love about these is I get my friends in is I learn loads because even with good buddies, you don't sort of necessarily say, hey, tell us about your childhood and stuff. So let's go right back, sort of salient moments. Give us a bit of context, your background.
Sure. So I was born in Canada. I'm Canadian. I was born in a tiny little village way up northern Saskatchewan. My dad was a pastor at the time, and we lived in this tiny little village, and we moved when I was little. So my life growing up, my dad is a pastor, grew up in a Christian family. But one of the things looking back on the faith of my youth is that I think I, in a lot of ways, felt a little bit like I was a grandchild of God. Like I was the child of a child of God. And I didn't really pull that faith in and make it my own. And I think, in a lot of ways, I had this safe and privileged and lovely childhood. But I think in a lot of ways, I misunderstood the faith that was presented to me. I saw the rules and I saw good behavior. And that's sort of how I interpreted Christianity. And so, until I was probably 18, 20 or so, my faith was just really shallow. And it was a sense of, I think there's a way I'm supposed to live. I should follow these rules. And that was sort of it. And I found in several ways in life, actually, when you get out of your comfort zone, out of your culture, out of your whatever, you look back and you think, wow, that is weird. I didn't realize it was weird at the time. But one of those things was my family of origin too. Susan and I got married. We were both quite young. We were in high school. And I started spending a lot of time with her family. And I remember thinking, I didn't realize how weird my family was until I spent some time in another family. And you start to see the dysfunction that you were raised in. And I think that's one of the great things about, cross-cultural living is you turn around and see the defects in your own culture, or even just going to different faith communities, you realize, oh, these guys have something that we missed. So Susan and I, we started sort of living overseas. We'd been married 1 year, so that made us like 23 and 21. And we moved to Kazakhstan for a year. We loved Kazakhstan in some ways, but we had a really rough experience with our mission team. So the missionaries we were working with, there was a lot of infighting. There's a lot of dysfunction on the team. And we basically finished that year and said, well, we got that out of our system. Now we know we're not cross-cultural international missionaries. This is just not for us. And so then we came back to Canada. I did a Master of Business Administration. We moved to France where I got a Master's of International Business. In the middle there, we had our 4 kids. One was born in France. The next 2 were born back in Canada. And then we went back to France for me to get my PhD. And our 4th was born there. So it was at that end of that PhD where we first felt a call to Africa, which, because of our previous experience in Kazakhstan, it did feel like it sort of hit us out of the blue because we had not thought about it at all.
In terms of chronology, I think that's where we met, wasn't it? Wasn't it about 2014?
Yeah. So we were in France and we came to do like a preview trip. And Rob and I, we landed, this other family, we were going to move to Burundi together. I think we landed like 1 in the morning. We came to church, and then after church, yeah, there was a bunch of families having pizza, and that's where we met you.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I look back and I mean, it's almost funny because, so this is my perspective and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're doing this exploratory trip with your buddy Rob, and I think I connected you a few days later at the beach as well. This is Lake Tanganyika. It's Burundi's landlocked, but it's the longest lake in the world. It's got a nice beach, and then we kept in touch. And I wrote to both of you and said you might be considering coming out, but why didn't you just wait a few months? This is now 2015. It was leading up to the elections. We suspected that in April, when the president would announce either he was standing down, which was what the international community wanted, or he'd be carrying on for a third term, things would really kick off. And so it was in April that announcement would be made. And sure enough, April 26th, people started pouring on the streets, and the first dead bodies that was having tweets and gunfire and burning barricades. And we're in the thick of it. And was Rob just wiser than you because he didn't come out then? and you guys arrived, what, 2 weeks? Was it 2 weeks before?
We arrived like the 5th of March. And so we had spent 4 weeks in a temporary house. I think we'd been in our house like 2 days when the violence started.
Is the lesson that you should listen to Simon Gilbert's advice sometimes? Go on, carry on.
And I mean, the thing is, like, Susan and the kids had never been to sub-Saharan Africa. I was the only one who came on a preview trip. I had been to sub-Saharan Africa once for 4 weeks to Ethiopia, and then there's like 6 days in Burundi. And then there we are, our kids are little, and suddenly there's, burning barricades and chanting and riots and dead bodies. And we're like, oh man, what did we just get ourselves into?
And you lived up on the hill, didn't you? We were down, just lower down, which means that actually sound is completely muffled. So there'd be gun battles going on that we wouldn't hear at all. But it's almost like you were in an amphitheater of getting sort of Dolby stereo sound, weren't you, up the hill?
We could hear all of it. And that's what it always felt like, is that we were in like this, in the Buja War Amphitheater. And in some ways it was nice because you could always keep track of where the violence was, what side of the city. But yeah, it got old pretty quick. So the reason we went was for me to lead the MBA program and to teach and to work with the administration at Hope Africa University. It's a university that was started by the Free Methodist Church. And, I had my PhD. Before we moved to Burundi, we were planning on moving back to North America, where I would become a business prof at a university. And so we thought, this is just perfect. And so it seemed like this move to Bujumbura just was so incredible. So within a couple of weeks, the violence started. One of my MBA classes was an evening class, and I have memories of teaching with my back to a window, and all of a sudden a gun battle erupts on the street right behind me, and I watch my students drop to the floor and roll into the corner to hide from the bullets. And I'm thinking, no one ever taught me how to respond to this. Like, this was not part of my PhD training. When they teach you how to become a university prof, they don't tell you what to do in case of gunfire. And we were there. We left to Rwanda for a couple months and came back, and then so we were there for the violence in December, when it was 16 hours of nonstop fighting, and we could hear it all from our house, and we heard tracer fire whistling over our house, and our kids were hiding under the beds, and our mission was finally like, this is not a family post anymore. You guys got to get out of there. Can
I just share, I don't know if you know the details of this story, but most people, I think maybe you had left the country by the station, I don't know, were you there for the actual coup?
Yep, that was the day we drove up to Kibuye. We drove through it.
Oh, right. Okay. So I was praying, because we had become Burundians, the Gilbos, us five, we'd become Burundians. I said, we are not leaving. This is our nation. We live by faith and not fear. And, that's hard to work out what that looks like. But Josiah, who was 5 at the time, my youngest, had swallowed some popcorn into his lung. He was breathing like that. And so we went to, I think, the only remaining foreign pediatrician in the country, Randy, our mutual friend Randy Bonds, and he said, it didn't take long. He said, you need to get on the next flight out. He needs emergency surgery. He needs a bronchoscopy, which he couldn't do in Burundi. So Lizzie and the kids actually did leave and got on the next flight out of there. But it wasn't a fear decision. It was an operation decision. And I was like, thank you, Lord, because they're gone. And I was able just to concentrate on the job. And then what was beautiful was that thousands of people praying. And a few days later, well, just the day of his operation, he coughed. And out came this kernel of popcorn from his lung. And, doctors had told me that was, that couldn't happen. That was a miracle. And I'm just so glad that God used that to get them out of the picture. And, that's part of his story. That's part of his journey. And we've got to live by faith and not fear in general. And I think the default is to live from a paradigm of fear. And, linking that to your story, you left briefly, but you came back and you chose faith over fear multiple times. And Kibuye was absolutely idyllic. We were jealous of the Kibuye gang. We used to go up there regularly. It was a bunch of fantastic, mainly US doctors who are doing basically building up from what was a sort of derelict place from years ago, a mission station, building up a state-of-the-art, classy training hospital for the region. And they are fantastic guys. I could get each of them on to do a podcast. I probably will in due course get a few of them. So you arrive there and it's just perfect and beautiful, isn't it? At least to begin with.
Yep. Yeah. That's a thing. Most people kind of describe it as almost like Garden of Eden. Like it's cooler than Bujumbura, and it's quiet and it's calm, and the violence, in 2015, 16, the violence never came up country there. So it was just like a breath of fresh air after what we'd gone through. We hadn't even been in Burundi a year when we moved up to Kibuye. We obviously, quickly kind of shifted roles, and I started doing some work overseeing the administration of the hospital, helping with that, overseeing construction projects and capital projects, and started working on the security for our team, the finances for our team. And Susan developed what turned into basically turned into a social worker, running a malnutrition program and visiting widows and working with orphans and abandoned children and stuff. So those years we spent up there, our kids still feel like Kibuye is home.
Yeah.
It felt like life was so raw up there. Like the poorest of the poorest of the poor are right there at your doorstep. Like hunger and malnutrition and disease and death are not theoreticals. They are in your face all the time. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's an exhausting place to live in many ways, but it also just feels so real. I remember sometimes writing to our supporters saying, thank you that we get to have the privilege of being on the front line and seeing all this change. We get to see, when someone donates $50 and we can put a new roof on a widow's house, the ability to see her face when that happens, that's the greatest thing in the world, to be able to see kids get $5 medical treatment that saves their life, to be able to witness that. That is just, what a privilege that is to be able to be there.
And that is true, isn't it? Sometimes it's $5. I remember my 18-year-old pastor's brother died in his arms for the lack of $3 for the medicine across the counter that I've had umpteen times. I think listeners will struggle to believe there's poor countries and then there's Burundi. And, Burundi, I think the statistics right now are 56% malnourishment. So you sent out a picture once of Alma at the time. She was 4 years old. So imagine, guys, you got this picture of three kids, and Alma is 4, and she's this cute little blonde-haired Canadian girl, and the other two are Burundians, so they're black, and the girl in the middle, so Alma's 4 years old, the girl in the middle is 2/3 the size, and she is 4 years old as well. And that literally is the most powerful image, and I've used it multiple times to show people, to illustrate malnutrition, because it's the same age bodies, and this little girl who's probably dead now or will have stunted brain development from their malnutrition. So desperately needed work, and those guys are doing fabulous work, even now, many very dear friends. And you're part of this cutting edge raw community, regularly seeing lives definitely saved. It was, I would come up once in a while with the family, and it was restful for us. And we were watching you guys, and I suppose we were jealous on a number of levels of how idyllic it was. But I guess there's always issues. We didn't know all the church politics and the stuff you
Yeah.
go through as well. I mean, we don't need to dwell on that, but it was nitty gritty. It wasn't straightforward life, was it?
Yeah. No, it wasn't. But the one thing is that it felt in many ways almost like New Testament. Like you have we had an eye clinic and we had a surgeon and we had a malnutrition clinic. So it's like you would literally see the blind could see, the lame would walk, the hungry would get fed. And so it felt like this is what the church is supposed to be doing. Like this is what Christ called his people to do. And so it felt in some ways that felt so beautiful about it. But yeah, it was hard. There was, working with national partners that didn't always have the same points of view that we had. When we got up there, the hospital had just gotten running water. It had not had really electricity or running water for years. It was horribly understaffed. We couldn't find trained people to work there. And the same sort of corruption and infighting and things like that just tend to wear you down.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality, isn't it, of the nitty-gritty cross-cultural work. There's always so many more issues than just working when everyone speaks the same language and beyond that understands the nuances and that sort of stuff. And then by this stage, we'd left the country, but one horrific night, your world was completely turned upside down. I mean, this is kind of holy ground because I don't want to overpush, but if you can share as much as you feel comfortable to, go for it.
Yeah. So part of I think the reason why this felt like such a punch in the gut was because, as you stated, like Kibuye felt idyllic. It felt like the Garden of Eden. Like we knew we were safe there. Our community loved us being there. There was relatively little violence up there. And one night we were having dinner. We had 2 guests over for dinner. And every night we would have one of our workers, we hired him in the evening to come and wash dishes for him to make a little extra money. His family was still living down in Bujumbura. And I got up after dinner to go into the kitchen. There was kind of a noise at the door. I turned around and the door just sort of like burst open. Even as I think back to it, it kind of plays out in my mind as slow motion, like 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 guys, young Burundian guys just burst into the house. And it was so confusing. I remember at first my mind just spinning like, are these med students who are like pranking us, or is this what's going on? And the 4th guy through was wearing army fatigues and had a huge assault rifle in his hand. And when he stepped in and pointed that at me, and then the first guy who had come through, now he's got his hand on my throat and he's got a knife in his hand right up in my face. And they're yelling at me in Kirundi. And I remember just thinking, like, my mind is just spinning. I'm like, this went from, is this some sort of weird prank to what in the world? Like, this is the kitchen in my house in this incredible, beautiful, safe place. And now what's going on? There's a gun pointed at me and a knife in my face. And I realized what was going on. So I remember looking out towards our window and yelling as loud as I could. And the first attacker, he didn't like that. So he took the knife and he stabbed it straight into my thigh. And then he held it right back up in my face. And so now there's a knife that's, dripping with my own blood in my face. And it was sort of, the shock of that just sort of, your mind doesn't know how to deal with it. You just then you just kind of go from your mind is spinning to you're just almost numb, like, what in the world is going on? And they're all screaming and they're all yelling. I don't think they ever spoke in French or English. I think they were always just yelling in Kirundi, but somehow I realized they wanted me to open something. And I realized, they want the safe. They know we've got a safe here and they want me to open it. So I kind of said, okay, like, come with me. I was like hobbling along. We had a small safe in our little home office and I opened it up and there was maybe $800 and probably $200 worth of Burundian francs. And I pulled that out. And when they saw that, they were just furious. they got so angry.
Is this because you're the university? They thought that you had the money of the whole hospital because of your job?
Yeah, so that's what we found out later is that it turns out that they had been tipped off that so our kids were here in Kenya at the time, our two oldest ones going to school. And whenever I'd come here to visit them, whatever, I'd you can't get oats in Burundi, or if you do, they're brutally expensive. And so I would come home with duffel bags full of groceries, and they're usually like 20 kilos of oats. And
Right.
somehow our house helper got in his mind that those bags were full of money. And
Right.
he told people he comes back with duffel bags of money and it's hidden in the house somewhere because it never leaves.
Right.
And so they were expecting, I think, like a giant safe stacked full of US dollars. And so when there was a few $100, they just were furious. So I remember the standing in our home office there, and the first attacker, he got behind me, the one who had stabbed me, and he started choking me from behind. And I grew up. I have two brothers and two sisters, and I'm the oldest of our brothers. And so, we used to wrestle and fight and whatever. And I remember thinking, "Oh, okay, you need to let go now. Like this,
Yeah.
I actually can't breathe. You got to let go." Because, when you wrestle with people, even if you're kind of angry, when someone finally says, "Hey, let go," you let go. And I remember thinking, "You got to let go. You got to I can't breathe." And then thinking, "Oh, he's not going to let go." Everything got black, and I passed out. And when I came to, I was lying on the floor, in a pool of my own blood. And actually, at first, I thought that was a weird dream. And then I looked down and realized, oh, that was not a dream. This is going on. But for some reason, I thought I had been out for so long that it was all over. And so I thought, well, at least this is done. At least it's over. And then I sort of sat up and I realized, oh, they're still in our house. And what had happened is that when they dragged me into the office, they had grabbed Susan and our two guests, and they had tied them up with rope back to back on the floor. And the guy with the machine gun was standing there over them. They had grabbed our daughter, Alma, who at the time was like, I don't know, 7, 8. When she heard the commotion, she ran to her room and tried to get up into her bunk bed. And a guy followed her in there and yanked her off the ladder and pulled her back and like kind of plopped her down. And our son, Micah, who was like 13 at the time, had gotten up, and he'd gone up, go to the bathroom, and he was still in there when he heard the commotion. So he stayed in there. So we've got Susan and Alma and our two house guests tied up in the living room. Micah, I didn't know where he was, and I sort of come out of the living room, out of the office into the living room, trying to see what's going on, and they sort of just pick up again and start dragging me around the house, basically like, "We know you've got money, show us where it is." And so in desperation, I took him into our bedroom where there was like, a wallet with another, $10 worth of Burundian francs in it. And they started pulling me out of that room. And that's when I realized, oh, they think there's a whole bunch of money in here. And it hadn't clicked with me that I'm like, oh, they're looking for a big stash. And so I tried to tell them, no, there's nothing more in this house. And I'm pointing out, like out of our house, out the window. And they thought I was pointing into our girls' bedroom. So they go into the girls' bedroom and start ransacking it, pulling stuff off the walls and knocking everything over, because they thought I just caved and said, okay, the big safe is in there. And so they were kind of trashing that room, and then they dragged me in and sort of like, all right, show us where it is. And I got in there and I was trying to say, no, it's not here. And I mean, I can still kind of remember the look on this guy's face, like he was just infuriated. Like I had just tried to pull a fast one on them. So I get held from behind, and he yells something, and a different guy who walked in comes and all of a sudden appears in the doorway of the girl's bedroom, and he has a homemade hammer in his hand. And I remember thinking quick, like, oh no, this is not going to end well. And he lurched at me and then actually swung at my feet. So I'm barefoot on our cement floor, and I dodged it a few times, but then he came down hard on my foot. Then there was more yelling, and he left. And then the guy with the machine gun came in. And at one point, I'm being choked from behind, and I'm starting to lose consciousness again. Things are starting to go fuzzy. And there's a guy with just this huge machine gun standing in our daughter's bed. He's right in front of this pink bookshelf that our girls put their stuff on. And he's, like so close, like not even a meter away from me. And the gun is loaded because he had just loaded it out when he was standing next to Susan and Alma. He loaded it, and a bullet, spinning onto the floor. So the thing is ready to fire. And I remember him pulling it back, and there's screaming and there's yelling. And I remember just sort of tensing up my body and flinching, like, okay, this is it. Like, and, I've had a couple people ask, like, what were you thinking? Or like, was your, life passing before your eyes or anything? But it's like, this had all happened so fast that I was still basically in shock. And my mind was just spinning, trying to keep myself alive. And I remember sort of tensing up and closing my eyes, like waiting for the first bullet. And then I opened my eyes, and he hadn't shot. And then he sort of wound up again. And instead what he was doing was he was beating me with the gun. And so he ended up breaking a couple of ribs, cracking some ribs. And I had these incredible bruises on my chest that were the perfect shape of a muzzle of a gun. Mm. And they were, I think at that point they were so angry. I think they were keeping me alive because they thought I was the key to get the money. And I think by that point they'd realized this guy's not going to get us the money. So I think they had no reason to keep me alive. And at that point, I remember just before I blacked out again, hearing some yelling, some kind of screaming, some sort of commotion. And I didn't know what was going on. And then I passed out, and I, again, came to and thought I'd been out for a really long time, and I hadn't. And I remember when I came to that second time, I couldn't stand up, and I was just kind of pulling myself along on my elbows along the ground. And I remember crying out loud to God. I remember just crying. I said, please don't hurt my family. Please don't let them hurt my family. Please don't let them hurt my family. Like, I was just, this thought that I had been separated from them and didn't know where they were and didn't know what was going on was just terrifying. Because I think when I came to, I realized, well, this is what they did to me. Who knows what's already happened to my family.
Man, it's just got adrenaline, heart pumping just listening to all that. It's so vivid how you tell it. I guess quickly, in summary, just how did that sort of all pan out with the local community? Were they caught? Those details.
So one of the things that was really impactful, especially looking back, is Burundians I think there are people who know so much grief and so much pain. They know how to grieve in some ways that we don't. And so, the police were at our house. The police were called, and they finally came to our house, and they were there until after midnight. But starting at 7:00 the next morning, groups of Burundians just came in, and most of them would come in. They would sort of look at me. I was lying on the couch. I had IV hanging off of the truss in our living room, and they would just sort of say, "I'm so sorry." And they would sit down for what felt like just a really awkward silence. And I really have no idea how long. Some of them sat there, and then they would pray, they would get up and leave, and the next group would come in, and they would sit. Like, they had this sense of, you don't need someone to come in and tell you everything's going to be okay. You don't need someone to come in and say, to quote a verb that makes you see or minimize. They would just come and sit in the pain with you. And I think that's probably something we in the West can learn. In terms of what actually happened to the culprit. So the 4 who entered our house, there was actually 12 guys in on this hit. They were hired professional thieves from Bujumbura. They had 2 cars of them, 4 in each car and drivers. And so the yelling and screaming that was happening was a friend of ours whose name is Dieudonné, who worked up at the hospital, and he somehow caught wind that there was an attack at our house. And Dieudonné is probably, 80 pounds soaking wet, short little guy. And he came tearing down, and the yelling was him pounding on the windows, screaming, trying to scare them. And he scared them. They dropped stuff, they ran, and he chased them. So he had a stick in his hand.
Wow.
So he looked in the window, and as soon as he got to our house, he saw me being choked, and then he saw me drop to the ground, and he thought I was dead. Because when I talked to him after, he said, "Oh, I thought I watched them kill you, and that's why I chased them." And so here's one little tiny guy with a stick, and he like ran out of his shoes because he was running so fast. There's these guys with, guns and knives and weapons and multiple cars, and he's chasing them and, just willing to put his life on the line to defend others. And it's like that's one of the things I will keep with me for the rest of my life. I mean, the guy's name was Dieudonné, like gift of God. Like it doesn't get more poignant than that, right? Like he came down like an angel and saved my life. Of that, I am convinced. I'm pretty sure they were going to kill me because they had no reason to keep me alive. What we heard through various sources, and this was corroborated by those in authority, is that the news of the attack made it all the way up to like the president's office, and it was kind of a big deal because it was sort of like this, foreign missionary was attacked, and it was sort of like we can't have this happening. And so at some point the security forces were told, like, make an example out of these guys who did this. And so the night of the attack, they caught 2 of the guys as they were escaping. In fact, they dragged them into our living room and asked Susan and I to identify them. So we're lying there in the living room, and they bring this guy in. He's like covered in blood and handcuffed, and they're like, "Is this the guy?" I'm like, "I don't know." Like, there was a little bit going on, but he's got blood all over his shirt, and he was just caught on the highway, and says has no idea. But basically, what they did is they got that guy, and it sounds like they basically put a gun to his head and said, "Tell us where the rest of them are. Tell them you want to come and meet up with them, and you escaped." And so they found out where they were hiding, and they went in and killed all of them. And so 12 of them were killed.
Right. Well, listen, you got the whole family, obviously traumatized, counseling. Can you share that and where God's grace came in?
Yeah. One of the things that I learned through this is just kind of how weird and complex trauma is, that everyone deals with it differently. Everyone has different trauma responses, and everyone can get over trauma in different ways. And so, our kids were at very different ages when it happened. Susan and I had very different trauma responses. My trauma response, the biggest one for me, is I had this sort of super hyper vigilance. And so I had a startle response reflex that if you basically dropped a pencil in the same room I was at, that I would jump. And if anyone, like any noise that I didn't see and anticipate, would make me jump. So I was just like jumping, startling, flinching, like sometimes dozens or hundreds of times a day, and not sleeping well. Like I was so on edge as I slept that, most mornings I would wake up and I felt like I would open my eyes and think, wow, I'm really tired. I need to go to bed. And it's like, oh no, I just slept. That's all the rest I'm getting. And by the incredible grace of God, we had a trauma counselor who was a Christian who had just come to Kibuye to do a marriage session for our team. And so he had just been in Kibuye, kind of knew the lay of the land, had met us. And so within a couple of days of the attack, we flew out here to Kenya to get away, and he came to start doing sort of trauma counseling. But for me, the trauma counseling lasted a little over 2 years. It was this May that I finally had my last trauma session, and finally stopped having the startle response, stopped having the hypervigilance and the problem sleeping. So it was a long haul, like 2 years of basically weekly trauma counseling sessions to get over it.
Hi folks, this podcast comes out under the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, and over the next few weeks, over the Easter season, we're doing an appeal for a fantastic project. We are building a pastor's retirement village in Karuzi in Burundi. Basically, they are often these pastors left on the scrap heap of life, having given their everything for decades. There's no social security, there's no pension system in Burundi. And unless their family take care of them, they can end up absolutely destitute, hungry, and even regretting that they gave their life to ministry. That is so wrong. And so we are looking at buying 17.5 hectares of land, which means that the whole project will be self-sustaining. For £25 or $30, you could buy 100 square meters. And that is a gift that will keep on giving for decades to come, as every harvest season, fresh crops will be grown and provide for these precious people that gave their whole lives to ministry. It's a brilliant project. I'd love you to be a part of it. Just £25 for or $30 for 100 square meters or more. Go to greatlakesoutreach.org/pastors. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/pastors, so that we can honor those who honored him. I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor with their children begging bread. That's what we want to be contributing to. Great idea, brilliant vision. It's going to happen. Do you want to be a part of it? Please do. All right, let's get back to the podcast. And your voice, I mean, I can hear it's almost back, but did you think you'd never speak again?
That was a real possibility, and my voice is back, to 90% of what it was. But and this is actually one of the most painful things. I can't change the pitch of my voice very much at all, so I can't sing, and I feel like that's honestly one of the hardest things for me. That basically every worship service I'm in for the rest of my natural life, I don't get to worship in song. I don't get to take part in singing the praises of God. And when you can't, you realize how many hymns, how many psalms and song verses in the Bible, and how much of our worship is focused on singing, and to have that taken away is really hard.
Yeah, stuff that we wouldn't sort of think about and naturally consider. How has that affected your faith?
So there was a long time where, as I dealt in the middle of the trauma counseling, I never lost faith. I never lost sight of the goodness of God, and I never felt abandoned. I think mostly because I remember even that as I was passing out for the second time, when I thought I was about to get shot, there was a sense, I had this sense, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but I had a sense that God was in the room with me. Like there was this sense that I'm not in here alone. And I think because I basically thought I was going to die and I had no idea what was happening to my family, the fact that it was not worse than it was just was incredible gratitude. Like I felt like, what an incredible gift, how we got out of this. Like this could have gone, like I was getting beaten with a gun that was loaded and his finger was on the trigger, like one little flinch and that would have been it. And so I think we always had this sense of God's incredible protection, like sending down Dieudonné to help. But in the midst of the really hard, like those 2 years of processing horrific traumatic grief, I think one of the things I came to is I don't think we, especially in the West, expect to face pure evil. Like, I don't think we expect life to be really hard. And we're always surprised when we get hard things. And I think I realized, why would I have ever expected something like this to happen to me? And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, why not? Why do I feel like I'm exempt? Why would I not have to face something that is that hard? So many of the people we know in Burundi have been through things way worse. And so why do I feel like I would be protected? In John 15, when Jesus said, a servant's not above his master, if they persecuted me, Like, what are they going to do to you? And it's like, oh, that's real. Like, that's
Yeah.
Jesus meant that. And that doesn't mean we're all going to suffer like that, but we shouldn't be surprised when we do. And I think that's one of the things that God taught me. And I think the other thing that God taught me was that a lot of times we like to tie up traumatic events and sort of we come through them, we find healing, we find restoration. At the end, we say, God allowed that to happen because, and then there's some sort of nice explanation, right? Like, because now I know this, or because it prevented something else from happening. And this did not turn out that way. There's no tied up with a ribbon end of this story. There's, those guys didn't get money. They all died. My family experienced trauma. I'll never sing again. Like our whole community was scarred. And for what?
Yeah.
Nothing. No one gained anything. It was just pure evil. And in the book of Job, when Job is suffering, and he's got these bad friends with bad advice, and then finally at one point, Job starts questioning God, and then God, for like 3 chapters, like 38 to 41, God is saying to Job, like, do you know who I am? Do you understand what I have done? I created the world. Like I have created everything. And at the end of it, there is no neat answer for Job. God doesn't say, and therefore, this is why this happened to you. The feeling you're left with at the end of that chapter of Job is God's basically saying, I am so big and so great and so above your understanding, you're just going to have to trust me on this one. And I think that's where I landed, that God doesn't owe me an explanation. Like, God is good, God is big, God is powerful, and he understands why this was allowed to happen. Maybe at some point in my life, what we've gone through will help me to relate to others or minister to others or something. I don't see it yet. And I accept the fact that I probably never will. I have to live with the fact that I don't know why. I don't know why God allowed this to happen. But God tells me that he is in control and that he's good. And he doesn't owe me an explanation as to why this specific thing happened, because it's, that's above me.
Yeah. Wise words. And, what I find frustrating about these podcasts is just time not allowing us to go deeper and unpack all these things, because life doesn't necessarily resolve. And then you moved on to Rwanda and had a job there, and now you're in Kenya, and it hasn't been straightforward. And when I listen to your story, I suppose I just two things. One thing I love is that the first thing you said in terms of lessons learned and stuff was about gratitude, and I share that. And what's linked to it is that what you went through is what I always. Do you know what I'm saying? In 20 years, I thought I would go through that. Mm-hmm. We sort of counted the cost. My family, it was, when I went out, it's the most dangerous country in the world in 1998-9. I lived expecting to die those early years. It was very extreme. It's much more likely than the unlikely scenario that you went through. But I suppose you went through what I thought I might go through, and I didn't. So that's a really weird feeling for me in that. But what I say is the biggest gift Burundi's always given me, which is, I think, what you will say as well, is the gift of gratitude. Mm-hmm. And, you're a survivor. I survived by dint of just driving through ambushes, and, other people got killed and I didn't, and that sort of stuff. But I am so glad. I'm so glad to still be alive. Everything is a gift. When that guy said he was going to cut out my eyes and he came to my house with a grenade to blow me up, it was like the first time I said, thank you, God, that I can see. And so I suppose the closing thing I want you to touch on is what you're now doing with Living Contentment, which is a whole... I think that's a gift, your voice to the church in doing that. So as a last thing, can you talk about Living Contentment?
Yeah. So at the time of the attack, ironically, I was doing a lot of thinking and writing on the topic of contentment, of sort of this idea of just, can we say what I have right now is enough? And so after the attack, it sort of took on just a lot more meaning. It was a lot less theoretical. It's in the midst of all that trauma processing. It was like, can I honestly say I am content with what God has allowed to come into my life. And so, yeah, I started putting out a weekly newsletter on living contentment partially because I wanted to force myself to sort of wrestle with this over and over and over and over, and sort of find the places where we want to be happy, or we want to be satisfied or whatever, but real contentment to say, no, it doesn't matter. And I think this is the thing that God taught me. It doesn't matter if I ever find out the why. I will still be content with what God has allowed to happen in my life. It doesn't matter if, this hard thing is ever resolved. I'm not going to be content if it happens, because God doesn't ask us to do that, to put sort of parameters in place and say, okay, God, if you do this, then I'll be happy. But God asks us to find contentment in Him and say, like, do you trust me? Like, can you live in the life that I have given you and be content with that, because I've given you, your salvation. I've given you forgiveness. I've sent my Spirit. Is that enough? And I think that's a really hard thing for us to do, is we say, it's mostly enough, but if this one other thing could happen, if you could, cure this disease, if you could stop my from getting a divorce, if you could allow me to find a better job, if we could make our mortgage payment, if, then I'll be content. And I think that's one of the things that God has taught me, is that's not what true contentment is. We have to be able to say, no, with what I have today, can I live a contented life?
Yeah. Listen, folks, so George sends out a weekly email. I get it. It's full of wisdom and pearls and challenge. And so I'll put that in the blurb so you can sign up for that if you want to. Maybe last question, George, and that would be, all right, let's just wind back. 2015, a number of people have said, don't go, or go later. I was one of the ones that say, hey, go later. Do you regret going to Burundi?
Not at all. No, not at all. And in fact, I remember when the coup happened thinking, I'm glad we came when we did, because if we hadn't come in March, by April, no one would have sent a new family in. And so if we didn't get there when we did, we probably never would have made it because of all the violence. And when I think back of all the good things and all the hard things, I feel like, I wouldn't trade those years.
Seriously? You would prefer to be teaching as a prof in some nice sort of Canadian city than to have gone through all that and put your family through that? I mean, I'm pushing you on that because I think that's beautiful that you're answering that way. Really?
I mean, again, I don't have answers for there are things that really are hard, like my kids continuing to deal with the trauma of the attack. And I feel like that is so unfair and so evil. But at the same time, the worldview my kids have developed to understand, like, what does it really mean to depend on God? What does it really mean to not have enough? What does it really mean to have a lot? What does it really mean to live in community? All of these things that they have learned that honestly I didn't learn till we moved to Burundi, and my kids learned it, starting at age 3. And so, I think as much difficulty and hardships as we have, I wouldn't trade those years we had there for anything. And I feel like God changed all of us into better people because of it. And honestly, I think it's some of the hardest things are the ones that have changed us the most.
Yeah. Oh, bro. Well, I am so glad that is what you can say loud and clear. And I think that's a powerful note to end on. There's so much more, but you've left us wanting more. George Watts, everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon.
Guys, it's stirring, it's encouraging, it's challenging. I trust you've been inspired. And if you have, presume you have, please can you give us a good review on Spotify, iTunes. You can be in touch with me on simongilbo.com or at any of the other social media platforms. I'll put in stuff on the blurb for you to be in touch with George. God bless him. God bless Susan and the kids. Praise God, they've all got their own vibrant relationships with him through the challenges they've been through. That's what I want for my kids as well. I'm sure you want them for yours. We'll be back with another fantastic guest next week. So do pass this podcast on to other people it'll be a blessing to. And I'll see you next time. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. In the meantime, have a good week and toodaloo.